It had been a quiet winter evening, the kind where the wind howls outside and the faint hum of the heater creates a comforting warmth within. In the small town of Briarwood, nestled in the heart of the countryside, the Cunningham family had settled into their routine. They lived in a grand, yet weathered mansion, which had been passed down through generations. It had once been the pride of the town, but years of neglect had allowed the house to become a bit of a mystery. The paint was chipped, the wood creaked with age, and the large iron gates had become covered in rust. Still, it was home. One evening, as the family sat down to dinner, there was a knock at the door. It was an unexpected visitor, an older man, dressed in a tattered coat, with a thick scarf wrapped around his neck. His face was gaunt, with deep-set eyes that seemed to look through the very walls of the house. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said in a raspy voice, his hands shaking as he gripped the doorframe. "But I've lost my way. I've been wandering for hours, and the storm is getting worse." The Cunninghams, ever the kind-hearted people, invited the man in, out of the cold. They offered him tea and a warm meal, and he gratefully accepted. His name was Mr. Harper, and he claimed to be a traveler who had been making his way across the countryside. That night, they allowed him to stay in the guest room, the one at the end of the long hallway on the second floor. It was an old room, filled with antique furniture that had been in the family for decades. A large portrait of a woman, presumably one of their ancestors, hung on the wall above the bed. The family retired to their own rooms, but as the night wore on, an unsettling tension filled the air. Mrs. Cunningham, lying in bed, heard strange noises emanating from the guest room. At first, it sounded like soft muttering, as if Mr. Harper were talking in his sleep. Then came a faint scratching sound, like fingernails running across the wooden floor. Mrs. Cunningham tried to ignore it, convincing herself it was the wind, or perhaps a creaky floorboard. But when she woke up the next morning, she found that the scratching sound had not been a figment of her imagination. A large, deep gouge had been carved into the wooden door to the guest room, as if something had tried to break through. Her heart raced as she called her husband, who immediately went upstairs to investigate. Mr. Cunningham knocked on the door. There was no response. He opened it cautiously, but the room was empty. The bed was neatly made, and there were no signs of Mr. Harper. Confused, Mr. Cunningham searched the entire house, but there was no trace of the strange guest. He found it odd, but dismissed it as the result of an overactive imagination. The following evening, another knock came at the door. It was Mr. Harper. He looked the same as before, though his face was paler, and his eyes held a strange, distant look. "Thank you for your hospitality," he said, voice almost mechanical. "The storm is worse now, and I fear I may not make it through the night if I don't seek shelter." Despite the eerie feeling that hung in the air, the Cunninghams felt compelled to allow him back in. After all, what harm could there be? Perhaps they had misjudged the situation the previous night. They offered him a warm meal again, though this time they noticed that his manner was odd. He barely ate, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames of the fireplace. His eyes seemed to glimmer with something far darker than gratitude. That night, as the storm raged outside, strange occurrences began to unfold. Mrs. Cunningham, unable to sleep, heard the same mutterings from the guest room. The scratching sounds came again, only this time it sounded louder, more frantic. She woke her husband, who immediately went to investigate. He knocked, but this time there was no response. He opened the door to find the room in disarray. The once pristine bed was now overturned, the sheets twisted and torn. A dark stain covered the floor near the door, and the gouge marks in the wood had deepened, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. "Harper?" Mr. Cunningham called. "Mr. Harper, are you here?" A voice, not Harper's, came from the shadows. "I'm still here, Mr. Cunningham, and I'm not leaving." The voice was cold and hollow, like the wind howling outside. Mr. Cunningham's heart skipped a beat. He rushed back to the family, telling them that something wasn't right. The family decided they could not let the strange guest stay any longer. The next morning, they planned to ask him to leave, but when they went to the guest room, he was gone. Again. Days passed, and the Cunninghams thought little of it, dismissing the strange happenings as the result of their own fatigue. But then, every night, the same routine would repeat. A knock at the door. Mr. Harper appearing with that distant, hollow look in his eyes. The eerie mutterings, the scratching sounds, and the increasingly unsettling presence in the house. One evening, as the Cunninghams sat in the parlor, Mr. Harper appeared yet again. This time, he did not knock. He simply opened the door and walked in. His clothes were now soaked through, his face gaunt and ashen. But something was different. His eyes had darkened, as if they had absorbed the very shadows of the room. "I will not leave," he whispered, his voice a rasping hiss. "This house is mine now. I have been here longer than you know." The family stared in shock, unable to understand. Mr. Cunningham, shaking with fear, tried to confront the man, but before he could take a step, the door slammed shut behind them. The house seemed to come alive, creaking and groaning, as if it were reacting to the presence of Mr. Harper. Mrs. Cunningham screamed as the lights flickered and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch unnaturally. The walls appeared to close in on them, the air growing cold, with an unnatural chill. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from upstairs. Mr. Cunningham rushed to check, but when he reached the top of the stairs, he found the hallway completely empty. The guest room door was wide open, and in the center of the room stood a figure, Mr. Harper, or what had once been him. His body had contorted unnaturally, as if something was trying to force its way out from within him. His limbs were bent at strange angles, and his eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. "I told you," the thing whispered, its voice now a cacophony of different tones. "I am the guest who will never leave. I have been here before, and I will be here forever." The Cunninghams tried to run, but the house would not let them. The walls shifted, trapping them inside. Desperate, they tried to escape through the back door, but when they reached it, they found it sealed shut, as if the house itself were alive, preventing them from leaving. The last thing they saw was the shadowy figure of Mr. Harper looming in the doorway, his hollow eyes staring into their very souls. And then, everything went dark. The town of Briarwood never saw the Cunninghams again. The mansion still stands at the end of the road, but it has fallen into further disrepair. The gates are rusted shut, and the windows are boarded up. But if you pass by on a stormy night, you might hear the faint sound of scratching at the door, and a whisper carried on the wind. "I'm still here. I'm never leaving."